Hello, everyone, and welcome to this online event, Dismantling Israel's Green Colonialism, How the Liberation of Palestine is of essence for climate justice. My name is Shora Ismailian, and I work as a cultural journalist based in Malmo, and will be the moderator tonight. All around the world, especially in the student movement, we see seeds of cooperation being planted between the climate justice movement and the solidarity movement for Palestine. That is why Israel's genocidal war in Gaza concerns us all, not only because we are witnessing Israel's racist policies backed by the rich countries in the global north, that has been going on for more than 76 years, but also because the ongoing crimes against the Palestinian people makes the creation of a just world impossible. For decades, Israel has been pinkwashing and artwashing its occupation and apartheid. Now it is also greenwashing its crimes. As the representative of the global imperialism in the Middle East and as the last settler colonial state, Israel is partnering up with the authoritarian Gulf states and Egypt in gas extraction, water projects, and other so-called solutions to the ongoing climate crisis. We need to understand the links in between and the bridges between these oppressions to be able to build a strong movement in solidarity with all people living in injustice. To give you a deeper understanding on why climate conditions meet political ones in Gaza, I would like to read a short passage from the foreword of Shuridiye Simolavi's new book, Environmental Warfare in Gaza, and it's written by Eyal Weizman. So he writes, "The desert edge is here not only environmental in Gaza, but also a political line weaponized by Zionist colonialization as a tool of dispossession and control. The desert has been mobilized as part of a siege that surrounds the Gaza Strip alongside a complex system of fortification that Israel calls the Gaza envelope. These include several layers of razor wire fences, concrete walls, extending underground towers, ramparts, security roads, and electronic systems that weave them together. Beyond this are a series of military bases on land belonging to the Palestinian villages of Deir Sunayad, Simsim, Najd Huj, Al-Huraq, Al-Zuriya, Abu Sitta, Wahaidat, and the Tarabian and Hanajr Palestinian Bedouin tribes, made refugees in the besieged Gaza Strip. This was the interlinked system dismantled by Hamas operatives on October 7, 2023. The siege over Gaza includes the damming of groundwater for the benefit of the Israeli settlements surrounding Gaza. On the Israeli-controlled side are miles of field crops, strawberries, melons, herbs, and cabbage, irrigated by state-of-art watering system and benefiting from the majority of aquifer waters. To the eye of the colonizer, looking from across the fence, Palestinian lands seem like dead lands. It wasn't always like this. From the time of the British Mandate to the turn of the 20th century, as this book makes clear, despite displacement and occupation, the area was plentiful with orange groves, fruit orchards, and sustenance fields. All this is now gone. East of the siege line, the landscape immediately turns dry. It includes a hundreds of meter wide liminal zone in which the mere presence of any agriculture at all is based on nothing but the ingenuity of its Palestinian farmers, cultivating with little available water. The Nakba has also a lesser-known environmental dimension, the complete transformation of the environment, the weather, the soil, the loss of the indigenous climate, the vegetation, the skies. The Nakba is a process of colonially imposed climate change. The environment is not the collateral damage of history, but a tool in its arsenal of transformation, a form of government over land, people, and the relationship between them. The environment is one of the means by which colonial racism is enacted. Land is grabbed, siege lines fortified, and violence perpetuated. We have invited this eminent panel here tonight, Swedish time tonight, Lucia Rebolino, Hamza Hamouchen, and Adam Haniyeh, to discuss the link between the struggle against Israel's warfare, but also its occupation and colonialization of Palestinian land, and the struggle for climate justice that seeks to remedy how climate change impacts different people differently across the world. We hope that this discussion can help building a stronger movement when it comes to solidarity with the Palestinian people, climate justice, and the anti-colonial struggle. These movements need to be interlinked to be able to make a change in the power relations in our world. So climate justice is not possible without the liberation of people living under occupation. And the liberation of people living under occupation and oppression is not possible without climate justice in today's world. This was my introduction. I would like to welcome Hamza Hamouchen. He is a London-based Algerian researcher, activist, commentator. His work focuses on issues of extractivism, resources, land, and food sovereignty, as well as climate, environmental, and trade justice. His latest book is Dismantling Green Colonialism, Energy and Climate Justice in the Arab World. We also have Adam Haniyeh. He's a professor of political economy and global development at the Institute of Arab Islamic Studies, University of Exeter. His forthcoming book, Crude Capitalism, Oil Corporate Power and the Making of the World Market, will be published by Verso Book this September. We also have Lucia Rebolino, is an architect and research-based computational designer. She is a researcher at Forensic Architecture in London and a teaching associate of computational design practices at Columbia University. She conceives her practices as a space where different branches of science and design can conceptualize, critique, and visualize and provoke new counter-category aesthetics. Thank you all for being here, and thank you all for joining in to listen to this discussion. I wanted to start with you, Hamza. I would like you to talk a bit and give an introduction on the link between climate crisis and colonialism.
Well, do you hear me? Do you hear me well? Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Shora, for the kind introduction, and thanks for helping to organize this important discussion to illuminate the links between climate justice and Palestinian liberation. I just want to start by emphasizing some of the points that you've said, recognizing the reality of genocide right now in Palestine in whatever we do and whatever we write about in terms of research, activism, whether we talk about empire, colonialism, capitalism, the environmental and climate crisis. I think it's important to center Palestine, because like yourself, I don't believe that there will be no climate justice on occupied land and without uprooting colonialism in all its forms from our lands. I think an important point also to highlight in here is that the genocide taking place right now in Gaza can be a harbinger of worse things to come if we don't organize and fight back rigorously and with much more determination than ever. And I think in here the words of the President Petro, the Colombian President Petro, words that he uttered at the COP28, the climate summit in Dubai. He said genocide and barbaric acts unleashed against the Palestinian people is what await those who are fleeing the south because of the climate crisis. What we see in Gaza is the rehearsal of the future. And I think it's really important to ponder over these words because there is a huge risk. And from what we are seeing in terms of the climate policies and the maintaining of climate in injustices and other colonial dynamics, a risk of sacrificing millions of black, brown, and poor working class, white working class people to safeguard the climate for the richest or the global elites. So I think these are the 2 points I wanted to start with. You mentioned the Nakba. The Nakba. I think Palestinians commemorated the 76th anniversary of the Nakba a few weeks ago, and they are living another Nakba, perhaps much more sophisticated in its use of weaponry, and maybe worse in terms of its devastating impacts. And I think in here it's really important to make the link between war, militarism, and the climate crisis. Just one piece of statistic, a number that is really shocking. In the first 2 months of the genocide, we saw that the CO2 emissions generated by that genocide were greater than the annual carbon footprint of more than 20 of the world's most climate vulnerable nations. 99% of it is attributable to Israel's aerial bombardment and ground invasion, but also half of the total CO2 emissions were down to US carriage planes flying military supplies to Israel, which points, first of all, to the active role and the full complicity of the US and a full participant in the genocidal and ecocidal war, but also the links between war, militarism, and the escalation of the climate crisis. The other points that I want to touch about is around the colonial orientalist environmental narratives around the environment in the Arab region that has been used in other contexts as well, that has been developed since colonial times. So we have this Euro Anglo-American imaginary about the environment in the Arab world, presenting it as alien, exotic, abnormal, and frequently degraded and defective in need of improvement, restoration, and repair. And in this story, the native and the indigenous play the role of the ecological savages responsible for destroying that environment. The iteration of this colonial orientalist and racist environmental narrative we are seeing today, and since the founding of the settler colony of Israel, is that Israel made the desert bloom. However, this is a very deceptive narrative. It obfuscates the realities of mass displacement, ethnic cleansing, destructions of environment, plundering of resources, including water, as well as apartheid. And Israel represents itself as this kind of an environmental champion while dispossessing and oppressing Palestinians. So this narrative must be challenged and deconstructed. The other thing that I wanted to touch on quickly before going to talk specifically about the climate crisis is the question of water apartheid and how decades of plunder and appropriation of these resources through water apartheid practices and infrastructures in terms of appropriation of water resources, control of the supply of water, the obstruction and development of the infrastructure, as well as its destructions through various ways, including war. And the important fact that needs to be highlighted here is that the majority of water resources in occupied Palestine are controlled by Israel. And only 50% of households in the West Bank, for example, have access to water on a daily basis. 30% in Gaza, that was before the genocide. 95% of the water resources in Gaza are contaminated. I think it's much more right now. Um, and then we have the inequalities in terms of water access. So the settlers have much more access to water than the Palestinians. And then the climate crisis. So clearly we are living through an escalation or worsening of the climate crisis, and its effects are seen everywhere. But I think those effects are differentiated through class, through gender, through racial lines, through urban and rural areas, as well as from north to south, but also through colonized and colonizer lands. So we know that the East Mediterranean is going to be one of the worst impacted regions in the world in terms of the escalation of the climate crisis. Um, that will affect the precipitations, the rainfall, and the worsening of water poverty and access to water. So even though Israelis and Palestinians are inhabiting in the same physical terrain, the impacts are and will be very asymmetrical. In other terms, Palestinians will be much more impacted for various reasons. First of all, Palestinians' vulnerability should be placed in a brutal context of 100 years of colonialism, occupation, apartheid, dispossession, displacement, and oppression. The climate crisis is basically amplifying and exacerbating the existing injustices, inequalities, dependencies, and relations of dominations. So while Israel is one of the least vulnerable countries to climate crisis, because it has certain readiness in terms of technology, in terms of finance, it has done that through grabbing and appropriating Palestinians' resources, through developing technologies with the help of the centers of empire that they deny to Palestinians. So the ability to adapt to climate change in Palestine and Israel is very much differentiated according to race, religion, legal status, as well as playing out through the settler colonized lines. That's what some people call climate or eco apartheid. So, in this context of the escalating environmental and climate crisis, Israel presents itself as a champion of green technologies, desalination, renewable energy projects in Israel and beyond. Basically, it greenwashes its settler colonial and apartheid regime. And it's doing that through various ways. It's doing that through the desalination projects that is exporting and implementing in other parts of the world, including in the Arab region. It's doing that through the renewable energy projects, including solar farms and wind farms in the occupied Golan Heights and in the Nakab and the West Bank. And it's also doing it through eco-normalization deals in terms of renewable energy projects with other countries, including in the Arab region. In the book that you mentioned, Shora, Dismantling Green Colonialism, the Palestinian scholar and activist Manal Shqair documented some of those eco-normalization deals, specifically looking at a project between Jordan, Israel, through the Emiratis called Prosperity Project. And she says, in regarding this project, Jordan will remain hostage to imports of natural gas, particularly from Israel, while it exports its own green energy in order to receive desalination water from Israel that plundered and depleted Jordan's water in the first place. So what we are seeing through these eco-normalization deal is the attempt by Israel to integrate itself into the Arab region's economic and energy spheres in a dominant position, creating new dependencies that strengthen the normalization agenda and posit Israel as an indispensable partner. And with the exacerbating climate and energy crisis, those countries that went through those eco-normalization deals become reliant on Israel, in Israeli energy and water, as well as technology. And they may start seeing the Palestinian struggle as a matter of lesser importance to their water and energy security. I think I'll finish by saying something quickly on the new licenses to explore for gas in the East Mediterranean that Israel gave to Western and Israeli companies in the first few weeks of the genocide. And what that shows and highlights, first of all, is that colonialism is about resource plunder, is about economic dispossession, but Israel wants also to strengthen its integration into the global energy markets and to consolidate global fossil capitalism, which is the major cause of the climate crisis. So I think we need to see Palestine as a global front against colonialism, imperialism, and white supremacy. And the inspiring student encampment movement is one episode for that. And I think I'll finish here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hamza. We learned a lot only in this 10 minutes. And I think I would like Adam to take on here and to talk about the role of the ruling class in the Middle East and their cooperation that Hamza started to talk about.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Shora. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, great. Yes, I want to actually build very much on what Hamza's comments and also Shora's introduction around the current environmental destruction of the war. And I want to try to make an argument that there are, beyond the direct environmental destruction that we're seeing imposed on Gaza at the moment, there are other compelling reasons for why we need to place Palestine really at the forefront of ecological and climate justice struggles. And I want to try to argue that Israel's dispossession of the Palestinian people, the occupation of Palestine, the 76 years since 1948, was a foundational part to the emergence of an oil-centered global capitalism in the mid-20th century. And it remains so today. In other words, if we want to break with fossil capitalism, we are also need to stand in solidarity with Palestine. And the reasons for this go beyond simply the immediate day-to-day destruction that we see happening before us in Gaza, in the West Bank, and elsewhere. In order to make this case, I want to step back a little bit to, I think, a foundational moment, which was around the middle of the 20th century, around the time of the Second World War, where we saw two major global transitions take place globally. The first of these was the emergence of oil as the primary fossil fuel. This oil obviously had been used for many decades prior to that. It had played an important role, particularly in militarization and armies, the waging of war in the First World War and the Second World War. But it was really after World War II that we saw oil displace coal as the major primary fossil fuel. This occurred first in the United States, then Western Europe, and then other wealthier industrialized countries, and until encompassing the whole of the world. So this involved, of course, oil products such as petrol and kerosene becoming very important for transport and as a kind of liquid fuels. It involved the the development of new kinds of industries and products based around petrochemicals, which are ultimately derived from oil, plastics and so forth. And it involved oil becoming really a central part of finance and global finance as well. The circulation of oil money, or from becoming very important to how the US dollar function. I won't go into that detail, but it's an important aspect of this global transition to oil as the primary fossil fuel. So that's the first transition around the time of the Second World War and the decades after. The second one was, of course, the rise of the United States as the dominant global capitalist power. Displacing here Britain and France, British and French colonialism, as the older, more traditional centers of the world market in throughout the earlier period. So the US emerging as the dominant capitalist power globally, and oil as the dominant fossil fuel. Now, these two transitions were really very much interlinked. They fed each other, they supported each other. US at the time was the world's largest oil producer and also oil consumer, and it had been since the early 20th century. But the US also pushed the oil transition in Western Europe after the war. And this is where we see the Middle East really emerging as a core element to enabling the global oil transition to take place. So the Middle East at the time, just after the war, had large oil reserves, and this was very well known in places like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and the other Gulf Arab monarchies. And this oil in the Middle East was cheap and readily available. So the Middle East, this oil could be extracted mostly by Western oil companies, at least in the first couple of decades after World War II, and then exported to Western Europe and elsewhere, where it enabled this transition to oil to take place. So the Middle East was the crux of these two transitions. But at the time, the United States faced a problem in the region, and this problem was that European colonialism was basically collapsing or under threat from the force of Arab nationalism, left-wing movements, communist movements, revolutionary movements all across the region, from North Africa through the Arabian Peninsula to Iran, Iraq, and elsewhere. And it was in this kind of cauldron of anti-colonial revolt, where the US is trying to impose its domination over the Middle East, that Israel emerges as the key pillar of American power in the region. And this really takes place after 1967, after the 1967 war, which is a war where Israel defeats Egypt and Jordan and Syria in particular, setting back, particularly in Egypt, the Arab nationalist movements under Gamal Abdel Nasser. And it is at this time that Israel really starts to receive these enormous quantities of aid from the United States, enormous military supplies, financial support, and it becomes, and this is to paraphrase one of the former US Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, Israel becomes, as Alexander Haig said, basically an American ship, American carrier, naval carrier based in the Middle East. It becomes a launching pad for American power in the region. Now, the reason this was possible relates very much, I think, to some of the processes that Hamza described, which is that Israel as a settler colony, based upon the dispossession of the Palestinian people, looked towards an external power for its support in a hostile regional environment. The continual dispossession of Palestinians made Israel a much more reliable ally to Western imperialism than any other client Arab state like Jordan or Egypt or elsewhere. So this kind of role that Israel has continued to play since the late 60s all the way up to today is as a bulwark of Western imperialism, and particularly of American power in the Middle East region. Now, since that time, and moving to the much more current period, we see American strategy trying to knit together, to bind together these its two major pillars of support in the region. On one hand, Israel, on the other hand, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia in particular. So it's been a goal of the United States for about 30 years now to achieve a normalization deal between the Gulf, between Saudi Arabia in particular, and Israel, to normalize political and economic ties, to normalize diplomatic relationships between these two key American allies in the region. The idea being, from the American perspective, to build this kind of bloc under American hegemony, which could be a counterweight to any kind of any kind of threat to American influence in the region. So this is, as I said, been a strategy, American strategy, quite openly advanced, and we can talk perhaps in discussion about some of the ways this has happened for the last 20 to 30 years. But it really, in very recent times, in 2020, it came much closer to fruition with the signing of the Abraham Accords, which was a normalization agreement signed between Israel and the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, and also between Israel and Bahrain, and with Morocco and Sudan. So with the Abraham Accords, Israel managed to normalize relationships with these important Arab states. It had earlier done so with Jordan and Egypt. And what this meant was, in particular, the United Arab Emirates emerged as completely normalized relationships with Israel. So the Abraham Accords were signed in 2020. In 2022, there was a free trade agreement signed between the UAE and Israel, which was Israel's first FTA with any Arab state. And it immediately in those couple of years, between 2020 and 2022, trade between Israel and the UAE just exploded, reaching $2.5 billion in 2022. Now, this is really important, and it relates very much to what Hamza was describing, because much of the trade that is, and investments that are flowing both between Israel and between the UAE and Israel are taking place in the energy sector. So the gas exports that Hamza spoke of in his concluding remarks, the UAE is a major investor in one of those Israeli gas fields. The green colonialism projects that Hamza spoke of, the solar and wind projects in Jordan and Egypt, again are taking place with the involvement of the UAE and other Gulf investors, other Gulf states. So we're seeing this kind of reality taking place, and I think looking at the war in Gaza through this lens is really important, because it points to how Israel's role in fossil capitalism, because the Gulf is a major core of the global fossil order, is not simply in what it does to Palestinians in Gaza or its own production of hydrocarbons now in the Mediterranean, but its role in supporting and solidifying American hegemony between the Gulf, between Israel, between the United States, over the entire region. So I think this fusing of fossil capitalism with American power in the Middle East means that to stand against the climate emergency, to work to bring down this fossil order, means that we must also stand with Palestine, because Israel is a key node in how fossil capitalism operates globally today. So the urgency of supporting and being in solidarity with Palestine is really presented, I think, starkly to all climate activists around the world. So I'll leave it there, Shora. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adam, for this very initiative presentation. Lucia, I thought that you could continue and specifically talk about Gaza and the environmental warfare on Gaza.
Hi, yes, sure. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me and giving the chance to present today some of the work that we do and now we're doing at Forensic Architecture regarding the conflict that is happening in Gaza. And especially today, I want to focus on the topic of environmental destruction. So if I wanted to start with a brief introduction of what forensic architecture is. So we are an independent research agency, which is based at Goldsmiths University in London and utilizing spatial and media analysis to investigate state and corporate violence across the world. So we employ various technology and open source resources to research war crimes, violations of human rights, police brutality, or environmental and racial violence. So we are a team of more or less 25 people, which is very multidisciplinary. We're made of architects in most parts, as well as software developers, lawyers, filmmakers, artists, academics. And we frequently also partners with other experts, especially in history, sciences, anthropologies, as well as activists and many more. So forensic architecture has a long record in investigating kill and environmental destruction all over the world. And keeping with the themes that this conversation today has set out to explore, I've decided to go through one of the most recent projects that we have developed in the office. That is also part of the most large Gaza investigation that the office has been conducting since October 7, about the systematic destruction of infrastructure and land in this territory, which employ a range of methodologies and technique of construction and reconstruction of landscape, built environments, and man-made phenomena. So coming back to the presentation of today, I prepared this kind of interactive presentation. And first of all, I wanted to mention how we envision this forensic architecture practice. So it's forensic stays for the scientific tests or techniques used in connection with detection of a crime, why we talk about architecture. So more specifically, I want to show you this image because we intend architecture as not as a static or motionless form, but a dynamic and a temporal one. So the built environment is always and often unperceivable transformation and motion, reacting on and registering forces. So by examining the built environment, you can reconstruct the process and the narrative of its transformation, and you can read events and power structures through marks that are inscribed into the environment. So in that sense, architecture becomes a spatial record of forces that act around and upon it. So here again, related to the topic of the conversation of today, we can see some leaves that entered as evidence to reveal the practice of Israeli ecocide along the Gaza Strip. So in our recent work on environmental destruction, we've been carefully investigating the land, reading the landscape through lenses of different scales, dimension, object, and architecture in the environment. Another thing is that we tend to do in our investigation is the use of evidentiary aesthetic. So to read the land in this way is what we call the aestheticization of evidence. So the land already exists as evidence to the violence, and aestheticization for us is the process of revealing this latent evidence. So we often work with videos and images of violence captured by the public, to understand the source of evidence, and then we aestheticize them using visual and spatial analysis. And especially this series of videos that you can see now on the right of my screen show how in 2020 farmers, activists, and human rights organizations in Gaza sent us dozens of videos documenting the Israeli destructive practice of aerial spraying of crop-killing herbicides. So these videos indicate that as the wind is going westward in the direction of Gaza, it will carry with it the sprayed herbicide toxins into the Gazan farmlands along the perimeter. Another key technique that we use for aestheticizing evidence is operative models. So we see physical and digital 3D models not as representations of future of fictional environment as they typically use in architectural practices or like game design, but rather for us they function as optical and analytical operative devices. And these spatial models help us to synthesize data and understand the way in which an incident might have been unfolded. So that's what forensic architecture is about. And our work, as I mentioned, covers like a range of topics: migration, decolonial reparation, restitution of state and corporate violence. But today we are going to look this topic of environmental justice, focusing on the case of Israel ecocide in Gaza, looking at the recent investigation that we made, examining the systematic targeting of farms, orchards, and greenhouses by Israeli forces since October 2023, and together also mentioning the previous investigation into herbicidal warfare, that is the video you were seeing before, and its effect on Palestinian farmers along the eastern perimeter of the occupied Gaza Strip. So, over 3 decades, the occupied Gaza Strip has been slowly isolated from the rest of Palestine and outside world, and subject to repeatedly Israeli military incursions. And this incursion intensified from September 2003 to the fall of 2014, during which Israel launched at least 24 separate military operations targeting Gaza, giving shape to its surrounding borders today. The investigation made in 2019, the borders around Gaza continued to be hardened and heightened into a sophisticated system of under and overground fences, forts, and surveillance technologies. Part of this system has been the production of an enforced and expanding military or like no-go area or buffer zone on the Palestinian side of the border. And since 2014, Palestinian farmers along the Gaza perimeter have been seeing their crops sprayed by airborne herbicides and regularly bulldozed, and have themselves faced sniper fire by the Israeli occupation forces. Then, going again on the recent investigation, since October 2023, Israel ground invasion has uprooted most of the orchard and systematically targeted agricultural farmlands and infrastructure through the besieged strip. This investigation builds on our existing collaboration with local farmers, associations, and agricultural workers to reveal the ongoing Israeli destruction of vegetation in Gaza and its effects on the food security and means of life for Palestinians. So I wanted to show you this image. So starting tracing the systematic decay of life over Gaza, this aerial image is what we call the last remaining orchards. So for the past decade, the Abu Sufi family has cultivated one of the last olive and pomegranate and citrus orchards along the eastern perimeter of Gaza, in a district called East Jabalia. And I'm not sure if you can hear my audio, because I wanted to play the beginning of this investigation.
الوضع ما فرش اقول لك كل شغله شيء تسقط يعني كل شيء يعني اثار للارض مسحوا المنطقه نفسها. هو ارض قريبه نفس القصه يعني في المنطقه اللي بقت يعني في عندهم حياه فيش حياه كده عندهم بالمره.
So these few seconds of video that you've just seen, we received from the farmer of this orchard, who was one who collaborated with us as collected through and ground testimony during the whole investigation. So directly facing this Israeli imposed buffer zone, these orchards and the lands cultivated by other families in the area were often threatened by bulldozing and by the Israeli occupation forces, which declared that any vegetation higher than 1 meter in the vicinity of the military no-go area is a security threat and must be flattened. In this way, the continued existence of the Abu Sufia farm and its neighbor confronted the colonial imagery of a flattened Gaza landscape. So later, during the 2018 civilian presence known as the Great March of Return and the breaking of the siege, in the area surrounding the Abu Sufia farm became a gathering place for protesters confronting the occupation. So even as a decades-long Israeli Gaza Strip prevent access to clean water and vital farming materials through carefully and as the standing Abu Sufia orchard nevertheless grew tall. So what we have been doing is try to rebuild using satellite and aerial image the traces of this changing landscape over the Abu Sufia farm and the neighbor agricultural lands, showing how despite the Israeli land expropriation and the nearby settlement construction, cultivation continued for decades until the early 2000s, when this agricultural area was uprooted and flattened to build roads and infrastructure to support illegal settlements. I wanted another part of investigation, the investigation we made, continued with try to analyze the systematic pattern of the attacks on the farm and greenhouses and to produce visual evidence. I'm going to close this one, otherwise there are too many images on the screen. Analyzing systematic pattern of the attacks on farms and greenhouses. And to produce visual evidence at this scale, we use remote sensing and satellite data analysis technique. So prior to 2023, Gaza contained 117 square kilometers of agricultural land, accounting for about the 50% of its total area. So these fields and orchards serve as a local source of food security for Palestinians. And our analysis shows that Israeli ground invasion has advanced over the 50% of Gazan farms and orchards, and we use remote sensing to measure the scale of agricultural destruction resulting from this military activity by comparing the region's vegetation index, which is an indicator of the health and robustness of plant life, before and after the invasion. So these comparisons are dated to March 2024, and where approximately the 40% of the land in Gaza previously used for food production has been completely flattened and destroyed. Together more with the analysis of vegetation, since the beginning of the war, Israel has dropped tens of thousands of bombs on Gaza, and vital agricultural infrastructure, such as greenhouses, has also been systematically destroyed since the launch of the ground invasion. So after the initial damage from aerial bombardment, ground troops arrived and dismantled the greenhouses completely, while tractors, tanks, and vehicles uprooted orchards and fields of crops. So in the early weeks of the Israeli ground invasion, satellite imagery showed an extensive destruction of greenhouses, where between October 2023 and March 2024, nearly 1/3 of Gaza's greenhouses have been destroyed. So in total, forensic architecture has been counting more than 2,000 agricultural sites, including farms and orchards, which have been destroyed since October 2023. So the destruction, to conclude my presentation, what I want to mention is the destruction of agricultural land and infrastructure in Gaza is a deliberate act of ecocide and a critical dimension of Israel's genocidal campaign. The targeted farms and greenhouses are fundamental to local food production for a population already under decades of long siege. The effects of a systematic agricultural destruction are exacerbated by other deliberate acts of deprivation of critical resources for Palestinian survival in Gaza. These acts include the well-reported catastrophic and Israel-made famine ongoing in Gaza, continued obstruction of humanitarian aid destined for Gaza, and the destruction of medical infrastructure beyond repair of the areas of civil infrastructure, including bakeries, schools, mosques, churches, and cultural heritage sites. And this is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucia. Gaza is being the most acute place right now, and that's why we asked you also to do this presentation, to see the links between environmental warfare and warfare on the people of Palestine. After listening to your introductions, I have two questions for Adam. The first is, you talked about the past 30 years, the US strategy has been this normalization, eco-normalization, as you call it. So does it make any difference if it's a Democratic or Republican president?
No, I don't think it makes any difference at all, actually. And in fact, I think both, this is clearly a bipartisan policy, and it has been for the last 30 years from both the Democratic and Republican presidents. I mean, the Abraham Accords were signed under Trump, but much of the kind of I didn't have time to get into the detail of the earlier phase, but the earlier phase was very much connected with the Oslo Accords. And that's where we saw normalization really take root between Jordan and Israel and Egypt and Israel. And the Oslo Accords was very much steered by Clinton and the Democrats. So it's absolutely a bipartisan policy.
I will come back with another question for you later, but I wanted to ask Hamza, because right now we are seeing this enormous solidarity movement with Palestine, both in students and in the streets of the global north. It's also being struck by the police, and the repression seems to get higher in the West as the Israeli repression gets high. It seems to be a balance there. But how do you see the link between the environmental movement and the movement, the anti-colonial movement, interlinked right now? And do you see any hope in this going forward?
The brief answer, yes, I see hope. I've been in those climate spaces for more than a decade, and I saw some transformations and shifts in the politics, especially the global climate justice movement. I've participated in many counter summit or people summit around the climate talks, what is called the COPs, and I've seen some of our radical analysis in terms of colonialism, in terms of racism, have been taken by some sections of the climate justice movement. Of course, it's not perfect. It's there are always room for improvement and connecting the dots and connecting the struggles. But I'm hopeful, especially when we see the trajectory and the evolution of the thinking of some young climate activists like Greta Thunberg, for example, where she came up strongly in her pro-Palestine activism, trying to connect the dots between climate justice and Palestinian liberation. We've seen also the connections with indigenous communities in those climate spaces. So connections are there, and I think it's about intensifying them and bringing them much more to the front. But there is always resistance. Like in some of the spaces that I've been, there is a lot of resistance coming from German lefty organizations, for example, saying, no, we shouldn't be talking about this. Let's just depoliticize climate justice. Climate justice is just about the climate and environment. Let's not talk about politics. And I think we need to continue resisting that narrative and connecting climate justice to questions of capitalism, questions of imperialism and white supremacy. So yeah.
Lucia, I had a question for you. When you've been reporting and seeing all this destruction of Gaza, did any part of your research talk about how this place would be able to rebuild? And then I don't mean only the houses, but also the agriculture. Is it possible? Is it possible to make the Gaza Strip a livable place after the genocide ends?
That's a very good question that actually we have been talking about it a lot between us during the research, because it's interesting how to see this systematic destruction of the land seems to have happened through different layers. So we've tried to imagine cutting these lands vertically and then see how there were different level of impact. As also Hamza was mentioning before, there was this level of CO2 that rises a lot in the beginning because of bombardments, and then there was this level on the land where we see the destruction of and the flattening of the orchards and all the food resources of Palestinians. But also there is this other topic of desalination that I think someone also mentioned before. So when there was the pumping of the seawater in some of the in these tunnels that then suddenly we stopped talking about it, but somehow still this influencing the ground, this salinated water going into the ground is so there is this land has been stressed under so many different aspects, and it's still being stressed under so many different aspects that it's difficult to understand how much time this land will need to recover. There are when we have been talking to some of these farmers, they also mentioned that they can't even envision now a moment where they can come back to their own land. So it's still an ongoing question, trying to understand if this land will become again for cultivable and from an agricultural perspective, but also livable. What part of this land will still belong to Palestinian at some point, and what it wants. So it's everything is going extremely fast, and as well with these ecological processes are fast in the way they're being destructed, and so it's difficult to answer with a proper timing.
Thank you. When you all talk, I don't know about you guys who are seeing this, but it all feels that the powers are up here. What can I do, and so on. And together with BDS Sweden, we organized this because we are seeing BDS going alive again. Boycott, divestment, sanctions against Israel, and once in history we saw that this actually can work when it comes to dismantling apartheid and colonization. But Adam, my question is, when I hear you talk and you hear the ruling class in the Middle East and how intertwined they are with Israeli politics, suddenly BDS sorry that I'm the devil here, but suddenly the BDS seems so tiny. So what is your comment on that? When the ties are so strong with the Gulf, with Jordan, with Egypt, what can BDS do, and how can that movement play into this?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that we need to remember that BDS is not simply a Western movement. That in the whole region, the idea that Arab states and other states shouldn't normalize with Israel, that there shouldn't be economic agreements, trade agreements, joint investments that we've spoken about. There's a lot of opposition to these policies by ordinary people all across the region, including in the Gulf. So we can see the way that the Gulf states have also tried to criminalize movements in solidarity with Palestine. In some of the Gulf states, because of their fear of the anti-normalization sentiments. So the BDS movement is a global movement. It's not simply what's going on in the West. So I'm much like Hamza. I think the enormous kind of sea change in political consciousness that we've seen in the last months globally really is a source of hope that we are going to see the end of Israeli apartheid, Israeli settler colonialism. I do think that the kind of mobilizations we've seen are really unprecedented over, since the 1960s in terms of like a changing of people's political consciousness, and where Palestine really is the center of so many other kinds of global struggles. So I certainly don't think BDS is a minor or just a small thing. You had mentioned the South African example and the importance that BDS played in that. We can see in this current wave of protests, activists attempting to shut down factories, to block ports, trade union and worker-to-worker initiatives that are really taking ground all over the world. And this was very much the same kind of grassroots movement that occurred in the South African anti-apartheid context as well. So there's a lot of parallels to draw here. And I just wanted to make one final point around the South African example, is that, when we look at Israel's role in terms of Western imperialism in the Middle East, and its special nature that I spoke about, of it being a settler colony and therefore much more likely to be an ally and supporter of looking towards external power for support. We see exactly the same thing in the case of South African apartheid. Britain and the US backed South African apartheid all the way up to 1994, to the formal end of apartheid in South Africa. And it's these similarities that tell us that the relationship between settler colonies and imperialism is the same or very similar all around the world. So we can call Israel an apartheid state, not simply because of the similarities with its laws and its racist discrimination, but because of the key role that it plays in the kind of architecture of Western imperialism.
Thank you so much for giving some hope to everyone listening in. I have some questions that has been coming in from listeners, so I'm going to read some comment and relation. We have Abdullah. He's writing, the relationship between the violation of human rights and sovereignty, freedom, and dignified living, and the effects of the current global system on the climate change is a profound one, based on control and the violation of natural existence. So that is a comment. And then we have Azad. He's writing, how does the fact that Israel is seen as a progressive environmental haven in the middle of the backwards desert people, he means then the Palestinians, drive the world, especially the Western world, silence on the whole genocide in Gaza? And how can one try to dismantle the idea that European environmentalism is the only way forward, since we know indigenous people tend to know how to keep their land alive through the ancestral techniques of sustainability? Anybody wants to comment or answer Azad's question? Hamza, maybe?
Yeah, I'll try. So I think, greenwashing colonialism, or Israel presenting itself as a green champion, championing pioneering technologies around desalination and renewable projects and so forth, is just one aspect of the colonial domination and dispossession. It's not just that element. So Israel uses that discourse to present itself as an environmental benevolent, but much more importantly, in my view and the view of the others, creating new dependencies. Israel tries to insert itself into the regional economy of the Arab countries, championing the technology. So in a role of dominant, basically. So those countries would start relying on Israel for their energy, water, food security, and then the Palestinian cause get buried. So I think that this is an important element. So that environmental orientalist colonialist environmental narrative is used at the level of discourse, but also materially in terms of creating new dependencies. In terms of the second part of the questions around the Western environmentalism, I think it's not the only one out there. There are various forms of environmentalism coming from different contexts, including in the global south, including from indigenous communities, including from the labor movement, from the feminist movement, from the anti-racist movements, trying to connect the dots and politicize the environmental question. Because we cannot talk about climate change and the environmental justice without talking about sovereignty, redistribution of wealth, challenging capital, challenging imperialist domination. So in here, there are lessons to be learned from various movements. And during actually in my work around those questions in North Africa and the Arab region, I prefer to not talk about environmental movements. I always talk about socio-environmental conflicts, because people link those questions together. There is an environmental element in the struggles for sure. People care about their environment. People care about their resources. People care about the climate. But at the same time, it's not just about those questions. And it's about, development. It's about sustainable and just policies that distribute the wealth. It's about also safeguarding the environment at the same time. So I don't think we can disconnect those questions. So yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on that? Otherwise, we have some more questions. Azat writes again. He says, as the question of land, its use, ownership, and that distribution, how can different movements work on this together? And I can read the next question because they are very alike. Anne-Marie Ledin, she writes, thanks for all interesting information. Do you have any tip, any of you, for the climate movement to learn more about how we can be a part of the anti-colonialism movement and peace movement? What should we study? Who should we speak to? Anyone wants to answer any of these two?
I could make a comment on the first question if you like, Shara.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a very good question, Azat. I think the issue of land, the control over land, very much links to the issues of resource inequalities and the kind of socioeconomic inequalities that Hamza spoke to. So I do think that seeing, there's a number of studies that have pointed to the fact that the region is actually the most unequal region in the world in terms of wealth distribution. And one of the prime reasons for this is the differences in wealth between the Gulf states and the rest of the region, the poorer states in the region. And a big part of this is actually the question of land and ownership of land. In the last 10 to 20 years, there's been a lot of kind of purchases of land that has been privatized under neoliberal structural adjustment policies in the region by big Gulf-based firms, agribusiness firms, and that is seeing this kind of distortion of ownership and increasing inequalities around access to resources. So it's I think these questions are very much interlinked. That we need to think about these cross-border flows of investments, the way that they link to privatization of land, opening up of land to foreign investment, the way that what gets grown on land these days in the region, where does it get exported, who ends up consuming it. All of these issues bring together both questions of climate as well as kind of bigger social and economic work. I would just say, maybe Shora, you are the best person to speak to the final question about who to speak to. But I would just say that some of the work from the Transnational Institute, where Hamza is based, around these questions are really invaluable. There's the book that Hamza co-edited on dismantling green colonialism, but there's also a number of other reports about environmental issues around land in North Africa and elsewhere that I really would urge people to have a look at.
Thank you. I also have another question regarding activism and how to pressure, because right now we see the street in the richer parts of the world being totally against what the policies of the Western countries are doing. And we see a lot of pressure in Sweden, in the US, in the UK, in France, not so much in Germany because of what's going on there. But of course, this is a very important place to have the struggle, both in solidarity with Palestine, as Adam was saying, that Israel is an extension of imperialism, but also the fight for climate justice, because we are in the core and in the heart of imperialism and in the heart of the place in the world where all the decisions are made and all the emissions are made. But how important is, because traditionally the solidarity with the Palestinian people has been there in the Middle East, in the streets of the Middle East. But how important is this interlink between climate justice and solidarity with Palestinians in the region? And do you see any start to that? And just to add, this region is full of authoritarian states where people cannot express and do solidarity and politics as free as we can in the West. Hamza, maybe.
Yeah, I'll attempt some reflections. In terms of the first questions, who to speak to or what to read, I don't think we're gonna go to a lot in here, but I think literature on imperialism, ecological imperialism, and equal exchange, fossil capital, degrowth, I think can be a start. I think it's really important to connect the dots in terms of this kind of literature, and I find it is useful framing to understand the ecological and climate crisis. You cannot understand it without delving into the literature around the imperialism and fossil capital. So it's really important to start with those. Regarding your question, Shora, I think the question of Palestine is central to many movements in the region. I don't think if I can say that there is a climate movement. Definitely there are some environmental activists, and during the last decade I've seen a nascent climate or environmental movements, mainly within the youth. Palestine is always central, but I'm not sure if it is connected in the way that you're presenting it as Palestine is important in questions of climate. Activists always center it. It is at the heart of what they do. They know that you cannot talk about justice or liberation or sovereignty in the region without talking about Palestine. So I don't think those discussions are at an advanced stage yet in the region, or at least with the framing that you presented it. Yeah, that's all I can say.
I could add a few comments as well, Shara. I do think that I mean I agree very much with what Hamza said. I think it's really interesting also to note that the way Palestine is often the leading edge of movements that then spread to other demands, other ways of challenging authoritarian states. You know, it's very clear that places like Jordan, Egypt, the Gulf states, one of the reasons they don't want people protesting around Palestine is not necessarily about Palestine per se. It's about the way that those protest movements can actually become triggers or the first nascent step in protests against the regimes as well. We saw that in 2011 in Egypt. You know, many of the kinds of you know, there had been earlier waves of protest movements in Egypt in solidarity with Palestine that were actually the first stage of, you know, big movements against Mubarak, and similarly in Jordan. So I think seeing that, you know, there may not be kind of obvious links there, but the way that Palestine can often be that kind of trigger and linkage to other kinds of social struggle, I think is really important.
Thank you both. Yeah, and unfortunately, what we're seeing in Egypt right now, when the regime just arrested a lot of people doing Palestine solidarity, it seems like Sisi learned from Mubarak's mistakes. I don't have any more questions at the moment, and we don't have any more comments or questions in the live stream. I was thinking of maybe everyone wants to say a final word. And also, we got a lot of hope from all of you talking about this, even though we're in the middle of a genocide. But do you have anything special you want to send to the people and the students on the streets and in the encampments at the moment? Okay, you feel that you said everything.
I like few words. Like I've been a student like since like few years ago. So like I'm a recently graduate. So like and I'm also recently graduate from Columbia University. So I like give my total support of what like students have been doing recently there. And then I really hope like this conversation and like the fact that they're like ongoing conversation like this one that we did today can like highlight some topics, like some hidden topic about this like this war and these like genocidal practices that are happening about like long this like fact of long-term destruction on the land as well as like the climate and environment. And I'm glad these kinds of event happen and like give possibility to people to like listen and understand and yeah, and think about it and reflect. So thank you for today.
Hamza, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think what we're seeing with the student encampments and the global campus movements is really inspiring. And I think it is subversive because it is, as I said, an episode and a front against the empire, against settler colonialism and white supremacy. That's why they are repressing it. And I think all of us should be standing together with them, encouraging that movement. I hope it can escalate and reach other sectors. And I think that's how resistance get globalized. But at the same time, I think we need to see some inspiration from the Palestinian resistance that we are seeing today. in the midst of the catastrophe, we are still seeing Palestinians are resisting heroically. So I think this is another matter of inspiration. I think the battle the struggle is gonna be long. I don't think we're gonna resolve it overnight. So my advice is to keep organizing, organize, and we need to globalize the struggle, and we need to think global and act global and connect the struggles between themselves. That's what our forefathers have done during the anti-colonial period, and I think we need to be inspired from those struggles and continue them. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, just a few final thoughts. So I think this topic and the kind of themes that we've been discussing are really, really key. And it's been a great pleasure to be part of this with Lucia and Hamza. But I do think that this question of why Palestine is so central to the climate movement is really something that needs to be just hammered over and over again, because we cannot really understand the global oil economy without centering the Middle East, and that means centering the Palestinian struggle. So I do think really kind of emphasizing that point over and over is really, really important, and it's great to see that it has become such a part of the discussions in the encampments and on the streets. The other thing I would just add or end with is that if we've learned anything from the last 76 years, it's that Israeli settler colonialism, Israeli dispossession of Palestine always works in two ways. It works in extreme violence that we're seeing today, and then it also works in the moment of supposed negotiations, supposed peace accords, and where Palestine might not be in the light. But both these kinds of wings, or both these treads, are both two sides of the same coin. They're about kind of cementing Israeli control over Palestinian lives. So when we see what happens after the war, we need to be alert to these kinds of eventualities, and we also need to be very alert, I think, to some of the comments that Lucia was pointing to around the reconstruction and the livability of Gaza, because there's already discussion in the wings about the kinds of reconstruction models that are being put forward, and we can be absolutely certain that these models are not going to benefit Gazans or Palestinians or be on the side of the Palestinian movement. So I do think we need to be very aware that these discussions are ongoing, and that we need to have, as Hamza said, a state of solidarity that endures post the war as well.
Thank you so much. That's a really good comment, and I just want to also add to you the thing that happened in Gaza in October it wasn't negotiations going on, and it wasn't extreme violence, and that's why October 7th happened, because the Palestinian issue was almost forgotten. But thank you all for joining today. For the listeners, we recorded this and it will be online for anyone who wants to listen again and to learn more, or the people who didn't. So please spread the link later on so that we can, as Adam said, hammer this connection between climate justice and solidarity with Palestine. So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.
Bye.